If you'd like to support this podcast, please check out our Support Us page at asymmetricalhaircuts.com.
Yes, do buy us a coffee on Patreon. That way you also get to hear our special War Criminals Book Club recordings with our fellow international justice reporter, Molly Quell.
He steadfastly insisted that he was guilty, quote, only of aiding and abetting in the commission of the crimes with which he was charged, that he himself had never committed an overt act. And I think I could have written that sentence basically for every single defense of a suspect I have ever covered in any trial in any court for war crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity.
It's often a bit of a riot.
And sometimes it's a serious discussion about books, and sometimes not, and sometimes films. And we'll pick things that portray the worlds of international courts and war crimes.
And it's only on Patreon.
Come find us there.
No one can act with impunity.
These are crimes that are beyond the pale.
We are talking about human beings. We're not talking about numbers.
We need a court. That's as simple as that.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Steph.
Hi, Janet.
So we're recording the week before the United States elections, first Tuesday in November, and like most of the world, we're really holding our breath while we wait for the outcome.
Yeah, because whether we like it or not, the US plays an outsized role in international criminal justice. It has money and manpower, and also it is a permanent member of the UN Security Council with veto power. So it has influence over what gets considered a threat to peace and security, and therefore also in part what atrocities get outside intervention and which don't.
And whether, when there are no states parties involved, something like an international criminal court referral can be made by the Security Council, like in Darfur, Sudan, or in Libya.
And whether an international criminal tribunal can be set up, like the ICTY or the ICTR, when we're talking about ad hoc courts.
So we thought that we'd invite an US academic, somebody who actually works also at the front line of these issues of peace and justice, Milena Sterio. So welcome, Milena.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, Milena. Milena is at Cleveland State University, and she is the James A. Thomas Distinguished Professor of Law. And she is also with Public International Law Policy Group, the PILPG, where she is the managing director.
But before we start talking about the US relationship to the application of international law, and of course consider where the US is essentially kind of missing in action right now when it comes to some of the big issues, we wanted first to just do a quick digression briefly into the big ICC-related news of this week. Steph, do you want to do a brief Stephopedia for us?
It's kind of complicated. I don't know how I can briefly Stephopedia this. Last week, there was a statement from the governing body of the International Criminal Court that there had been allegations of misconduct against prosecutor Karim Khan that they were aware of. And there was a referral to the report of the independent oversight mechanism, which seemed to refer a complaint against an elected official, which from the statement can be inferred that this is Khan, where he was accused of some unspecified workplace misconduct as far as the court is concerned, and that the IOM tried to interview the alleged victim, but they refused to give a statement and no formal investigation was launched. And Khan denies these allegations of misconduct against him, and he has now today said that he had asked the IOM to open a formal investigation, but we don't know yet if the IOM has indeed opened a formal investigation at this point.
I'm only going to add a tiny bit more meat on the bones, just to say that Molly Quell, who's a friend of the pod, those who listen will have heard her regularly before. She was part of a big Associated Press investigation, and it concluded things like this typical line, "We spoke to 8 people with knowledge of," which is what you get in investigative journalism. You don't always get the full facts, but you ask people around. You can read it yourselves. We'll put a link to that. And of course, she's not the only journalist investigating. It does seem to be a complicated situation where, for me, from the outside, it looks like there's a big lack of trust inside the office of the prosecutor, and also a lack of trust in some of these oversight mechanisms. Anything more you want to add, Steph, about what it's been like being a journalist working on this? Because you've been more on the coalface than I have.
Well, what we can say is that the AP and the Guardian reported allegations of misconduct of a sexual nature, or sexual harassment by the prosecutor. and they have all kinds of insider witnesses who I don't know who it is. I think the problem with reporting on this kind of thing is that the ICC already is an institution that is not very good in its communication from official bodies. And this kind of story only comes out with confidential sources. And it's also not really a fun story to have to report upon because you have to call people and press them about potentially unpleasant incidents that have occurred at work. You don't want to be pushy, but you need people to talk to you. And also, you have to be aware of not being used as a journalist to peddle or to expand a narrative that is maybe not true, but in the interest of somebody. So it's an extremely thorny and complicated issue, and I would much rather be talking about technical legal details and arrest warrants, yes or no, and what's in them, and not about kind of workplace misconduct. Although, of course, it is very important that everybody is in a safe working environment.
There, I can absolutely agree with you. And my instinct was also to look back at what had been said a few years ago in the independent expert review about working conditions within the office of the prosecutor, and to wonder to myself, how and whether and things can possibly change, and certainly hope that anybody who feels that they've been dealt with badly at any work institution should get the right kind of support and the right kind of investigation into what happened, and to make sure that there are sanctions in the end. Anything else you want to add, Steph, or should we move on?
Well, I want to say one thing, that looking at this, I was also looking at the kind of guardrails that the court has in place and the policies and what should happen if there are such reports of misconduct. And I found it rather staggering that a lot of that is not very clear. It's not clear what's going to happen now. It's not clear how an investigation should be led. There's a lot of things that you thought with the independent expert report, it was clear that there were reports of problems. The Office of the OTP was not considered a great working environment in the independent expert report. So you would think that there have been improvements, and maybe there are, but if you look at what's on paper and what you can trace as what is now the way to deal with this, it's very unclear still, and that really surprised me.
So let's move on again here now to the main part of the pod. And of course, we're going to have to refer to one of the other clouds that's hanging over the ICC. There's the investigation into the situation in the state of Palestine, and there are potential arrest warrants, which everybody is waiting for. So I'm sure we will get round to discussing that a bit. But the main thing we want to discuss is what the role is that the US gets to play on the bigger stage of support and not support for all kinds of international justice work, including the ICC. Why don't you do us your typical Reuters summary, Steph? What is the line about the US on ICC Palestine? What do you always have to put into your report?
My Reuters summary line is the US does not recognize the ICC's jurisdiction over Israeli nationals for alleged crimes in the Palestinian occupied territory.
And it goes a bit wider than that, doesn't it? Because, the critique by the US of the ICC has been very strong. It hasn't only just occurred recently with the investigation into Palestine, but it's been there. We could almost say it's been there right from the creation of the ICC. Before we bring Milena in, I just wanted to play a quote here from Carmen Chung, who's the head of the Center for Justice and Accountability based in San Francisco. And I asked her, since there are these elections at the beginning of November, is there really these issues of accountability for international crimes? Are they actually on the election agenda at all?
I think in terms of what is in the discourse around the election, international justice is not high. For international justice practitioners like us, it's always lurking in the background, right? Our Congress is right now potentially trying to sanction the ICC again. And that remains something that would be incredibly important for any new president to consider if that makes it out of Congress, whether that's something that they should sign. We obviously are concerned. We're concerned about the US's role with respect to the international community, its role with respect to the ICC. And even though that hasn't made its way into the discourse, that's something I think that's been lurking in the background.
So we'll play that full interview with Carmen at the beginning of next year, I think probably around the inauguration, whoever manages to get elected. So let's turn to Milena. Thank you so much for your patience with listening to us tiptoeing around that other subject. What is your take on this attempt by at least some members of Congress to sanction the ICC? I mean, does it take you back to other situations in the past, or do you think it's very much part of the current politics?
Well, unfortunately, when it comes to the U.S. administration sanctioning ICC officials, this is not new. As some of our listeners might remember, under the Trump administration back in 2020, the Trump administration imposed sanctions against the then prosecutor Fatou Bensouda, as well as another high-level ICC official. And that sanctions regime was also relatively broad because it included foreign nationals, but also dual nationals, people who are U.S. nationals and also foreign nationals, who provide assistance to the court on these investigations that the U.S. deems to be a security threat to the United States. Now, that sanctions regime was revoked by the Biden administration in April of 2021, so some 3 months after the Biden administration was inaugurated. But what we're seeing now are discussions again as to whether a new regime of sanctions needs to be imposed against the ICC, and in particular against ICC individual officials, because of the prosecutor's request for the issuance of arrest warrants against, in particular, Israeli leaders. And so there's a bill that was already passed in our House of Congress called the Illegitimate Court Counteraction Act. And that bill was passed by the House in June and is currently pending in the Senate. My understanding is that the bill is currently blocked in the Senate, so it's fortunately not clear that it will actually pass. But if this bill did pass, it would actually impose a mandatory sanctions regime where the U.S. executive branch would be obligated to impose asset freezes and visa bans on any foreign person who conducts or in various ways assists any ICC investigation of U.S. persons or persons from certain allied countries, such as Israel. So it would really be a sweeping and mandatory sanctions regime, which many experts, scholars on the ICC believe would not just undermine the court, but would be completely contrary to the U.S. foreign policy interests.
You've already mentioned Donald Trump, who is one of the two main candidates. I mean, if he gets elected president, then will this be enacted?
Well, if Donald Trump gets elected president, then yes, my fear is that Donald Trump would actually act. And, our presidents can also act unilaterally through executive orders. So this bill that I mentioned would be a congressional bill. But in addition, presidents can act on their own, can act unilaterally. And that is what Donald Trump did the first time in 2020. So yes, I do think that he would issue another executive order, which is a unilateral presidential action, by which he would most likely sanction at least some court officials, or at least, try to sanction those who somehow provide assistance to the courts.
Under the last administration, the U.S. has been trying to take more of a leading role on accountability, for example, by having the atrocity crimes accountability group in Ukraine. But can they really be a leader kind of in the Ukraine arena when they are such an opponent of the court in Israel-Palestine?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question. And I do think that what we're seeing from the U.S. is essentially selective support for the court for those investigations that the U.S. deems to be in our own foreign policy and national security interests, such as, for example, the Ukraine investigation. Obviously, Israel is an ally of the United States, has been an ally for many, many decades. And so the United States views any attempts to investigate Israel as contrary to our own foreign policy and contrary to our national security because of our allied, interests with Israel. And so I would say that at best, the U.S. support of the court can be seen as selective support. And I do think that when we start talking about selective justice, things get very controversial, because I don't think it's in the interest of global justice if we're selective.
I'm wondering whether, if at any point you can imagine that the US would consider its position in relation to its ally Israel in terms of things like arms exports. And the reason why I'm thinking about that is because the other main court in The Hague, the International Court of Justice, has come out with its provisional measures to say that because you need to protect Palestinians from any potential danger under the Genocide Convention. Israel has to change what it's doing, and we know that the US is supporting it. And then you've also got recently an advisory opinion from the court, and we'll put links to all of those things that we've reported on previously. But I'm just wondering, is there at all, you see, any debate around the possibility of this issue of arms exports?
There is, I would say, very limited debate, and there have been calls from action from a limited number of elected officials, congressmen and senators, to say the United States really should stop exporting weapons to Israel because of very credible allegations that Israel is committing war crimes and perhaps even genocide in Gaza. And obviously, under international law, this is contrary to states' obligations under the Genocide Convention. The United States is a member of the Genocide Convention, and the Genocide Convention is part of customary law, which is binding on all states. Under the Genocide Convention, states have the obligation to prevent acts of genocide. States can also be responsible for complicity to commit genocide. And complicity to commit genocide has been defined by the International Court of Justice in the Bosnia versus Serbia case as including the provision of means to enable or facilitate the commission of the crime. And so a very credible argument can be made that the United States, by providing weapons to Israel, is actually complicit in the commission of genocidal acts by Israel. And so I do think that those conversations are taking place on the margins, but I don't think that they have become part of the mainstream political debate, especially as it relates to the elections. Now, whether the United States will actually change its policy, I am very skeptical. I should mention that there was a lawsuit in the United States brought by a human rights organization called the Center for Constitutional Rights on behalf of several Palestinian organizations. And that lawsuit was brought back in November of 2023 in the Northern District of California. In that lawsuit, the Center for Constitutional Rights argued that by providing weapons to Israel, the U.S. support violated the Genocide Convention. Unfortunately, that case was dismissed by the district court, and the dismissal was affirmed by the appellate court on essentially political question grounds. The argument there is that this is simply not something that the court should be looking at, that these are foreign policy issues that under our Constitution, the executive branch is best suited to look at. Now, the plaintiffs in that lawsuit have actually requested a rehearing by a full court of appeals. So that is still pending, and we will see when that hearing is scheduled and when that is decided. But through that case, that is a federal court case, there is at least a potential that our judicial branch would impose restraints on our executive branch. And our executive branch would obviously, under our constitutional system, have to listen to the judiciary. Now, then the question is, does that case end up at the Supreme Court? And if it ends up to the Supreme Court, I do think that the court's conservative majority is much more likely to side with the executive. So while there's a potential for limitations on the executive branch's ability to continue to provide weapons to Israel, I don't really see in the near future, I'm not optimistic that these court cases will actually result in rulings, limiting the executive. So in short, my answer, Janet, would be to say that even though under international law, there are very credible arguments that can be made that the United States is actually violating its obligations under the Genocide Convention, there's very little hope that the United States will change its course vis-a-vis Israel in the near future.
Oh, it's interesting that you mentioned that case where the NGOs are trying to curb the executive branch, and the argument in the courts is that this is a political question, because that is the same argument that was made in Dutch courts for delivering the F-35 parts, but that was thrown out by Dutch judges saying that international humanitarian law actually trumped government policy in a way. I'm wondering, you talked about if Trump gets into power, that it would be likely that he would act against the ICC. What is the scenario then if Harris wins the presidency? Because I know from some friends who are a friend who's very pro-Palestine activist who doesn't like Harris because they're not outspoken enough, or they're also very pro-Israel. I wonder what the outlook is for a Harris presidency if you look at the ICC more generally.
Yes, that's a great question. So candidate Kamala Harris, I do believe, has lost some support by some voters in some American states over the Biden administration policy vis-a-vis Israel. And I would say as a general matter, when it comes to U.S. presidents, whether they be on the left or on the right, their foreign policy vis-a-vis allies such as Israel seems to be fairly consistent. So on the, for example, selling of weapons, I think that will continue no matter who is elected. Now, vis-a-vis the International Criminal Court, I would foresee that the Harris administration would not act unilaterally, would not pass an executive order to say we're sanctioning the court, because I do think that that type of unilateral and really hostile and isolationist action is not in line with the Biden and now hopefully future Harris presidency. I do think that the Harris administration would either try to rely on Congress and try to, for example, work the corridors to make sure that congressional acts are passed that would require sanctions, because then that would be out of her hands. Then it would be like, hey, Congress has passed this law that says I, the executive, now have to sanction these officials. And if that didn't happen, then my guess is that she would work in more subtle ways to undermine those investigations that have to do with Israel.
I wanted to also open the picture up out a bit and remind the audience about something which I think most people will have forgotten about, that there's also, I mean, there are so many different aspects you could talk about with the US, but just one is Guantanamo and the continued issue of prisoners who are still stuck there as a result of the war on terror. And that's off the coast of the United States and as part of a military base. Steph, do you want to give us a Stephopedia line here? I copied some facts and figures for you in case you'd like to deliver.
I'll give it my best shot. I don't write generally about Guantanamo, so I don't have the Reuters blurb down, but it is a U.S. naval base in Cuba. But in 2002, the Bush administration established a detention camp there, which was designed to hold terrorism suspects and what they call, quote, illegal enemy combatants that were rounded up after the U.S. push against Islamic extremists after the 9/11 attacks on the World Trade Center. Now, as of August 2024, at least 780 persons from 48 countries have been detained at the camp, of whom 740 have since been transferred elsewhere, 9 died in custody, and 30 remain. Only 16 detainees have ever been charged by the U.S. with criminal offenses.
We spoke to Alka Pradhan, who actually works for the Department of Defense, defending one of the people who are still there. And we asked her whether Guantanamo is playing any part again in the discourse around the elections.
I believe that Guantanamo is the most, or one of the most bipartisan issues in the United States to this day. It has been essentially rubber stamped by both parties. No one really cares about the men down there. No one in the United States cares. No one even knows. If you go to, look, I grew up in Ohio. If you go to Ohio, you ask anybody, hey, what about Guantanamo? They're like, is that still open? Number one. Number two, I thought we killed KSM. I thought we executed them, right? No, there's no public consciousness about what is going on at Guantanamo. And I truly believe that that is a factor of the racism that underpins Guantanamo. If there were French or German or Dutch or Norwegian nationals being held at Guantanamo, there is no way the facility would have been kept open for more than 2 decades now. There's just no way. It is because it is these 2 Americans, faceless, nameless Muslim men, that there is not more outrage about the fact that they're being held there. And the fact that, look, there's been no justice, there's been no process for 9/11, right? You can come at it any way you want. But yeah, there's no mention of it.
And we asked Alka whether there is any prospect, maybe if Kamala Harris becomes president, that Guantanamo would be shut down for good.
Both parties have sort of, I mean, obviously, one party considers it a good thing that it continues to be open. And the Democrats, I think, have basically taken it as a necessary evil. Even the most progressive Democrats are not willing to expend any political capital on Guantanamo because there's just this understanding, and I think it is the correct understanding, that the American public does not care. That is a success. That is the success of the Bush administration in making it an issue that Americans do not care about. And that is something that just keeps us very, very angry all the time.
Milena, listening to Alka there talking about being angry about this. I'm not angry, I'm just amazed. I can't quite believe that this prison is still open. Is this an issue that you teach about, think about, write about?
Yes, it's absolutely an issue that I think about, that I write about, that I teach about. But what's sad is that those Guantanamo detainees have been largely forgotten by the American public. And so when it comes to current political debates, nobody ever mentions Guantanamo anymore. And I would think that the average American person probably believes that there are no more Guantanamo detainees, or if there are, that there's good reason as to why they're there. Now, as you mentioned earlier, there's still 30 detainees held at Guantanamo. Some have never been charged with any offenses. They've been held there since 2001 or 2002 for more than 20 years, and they have never been charged with any offenses. Some have been seriously mistreated and tortured. Some are, by all accounts, essentially brain dead by now because of the treatment that they have received. And so they are likely to just be indefinitely detained at Guantanamo. Now, American Congress has tied the executive branch's hands to some extent. If you remember President Obama back in 2009, his very first executive order that he signed as the newly elected president was to shut down Guantanamo. But Congress then passed a law which basically made it impossible for the president to transfer any of those detainees to U.S. soil. So they have to remain out there in Cuba, or the United States has to find a way to transfer them to a third country. Now, under international human rights law, we cannot transfer anybody to a country where they're likely to be mistreated. The irony of that is that we've already mistreated some of them ourselves, but we cannot transfer them to a third state where they're likely to be mistreated. So the U.S. has over the years negotiated some transfer agreements. There's some detainees that were sent back home, some that were sent to places like Palau or Albania. But for the ones that still remain, basically, either they've never been charged and they're likely not going to because of the physical and mental state that they're in right now. Some have already been cleared for release, but the U.S. is in a position where we simply don't have any third country to transfer these individuals to. And then there are a handful of cases, as you mentioned, that are working their way through the military commissions, which is the court-martial system. Instead of the regular civilian courts, they're being prosecuted in these military commissions. The military commissions are problematic on their own, but I would argue that they're sort of slightly less problematic than not charging individuals at all, because at least there's some process going on. But to answer your question, there is almost no public discourse in the United States today about Guantanamo.
Do you think anything will change in the coming 4 years with the new presidency? It sounds from what you just said that the Senate has effectively tied the hands of any American president who might want to shut it down.
Yes, I think if anything happens is that maybe we'll see another handful of individuals who have been cleared for release transferred to other third countries. If the United States can find, sort of partners, if it can negotiate agreements with a few additional third states, then maybe we'll see a handful of individuals transferred, and then maybe we'll see some progress in these cases in the military commissions. But I do think that the sad reality is that when it comes to at least a group of individuals who are among the 30 still detained, they're never going to be prosecuted, and they will just spend the remainder of their lives at Guantanamo.
Well, it's really quite depressing, but I didn't want to end this podcast on quite such a depressing note. In the chat with Carmen from CJA, she was also quite keen to point out how the work that she does, bringing cases within the United States under conventions that the US has signed up to, like the Torture Convention, means that it is possible to actually make change, bring accountability under US legal system. And the whole premise of the interview was that the US has kind of joined the ranks of the countries that have said, whoa, we can actually now do some universal jurisdiction. And the Department of Justice has brought some Ukraine cases. Again, you can hear that interview in full alongside the one with Alka in January. But here's Carmen saying it's not all bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we've observed across administrations, regardless of which party is in political power, is that at some core level, the United States remains committed to human rights. And I think, what you point out is this ability that we've had to bring cases in the US stems a lot from the fact that our judiciary and our juries think that there is a role for U.S. courts to play in ensuring that human rights is respected around the world, and where perpetrators are found in the United States, that they are held accountable where they are found. And so that gives me hope, regardless of the outcome of the election. It also reminds us that regardless of the outcome of the election, and whoever is in power and whatever new administration comes in, is that they have a duty and an obligation to ensure that rule of law remains robust in the United States, that our courts remain open for business when survivors of human rights abuses come seeking remedy and redress, that we continue to play an important role on the international stage when it comes to international justice. And that means, first and foremost, that we do not continue to attack and demonize the International Criminal Court as we have been.
Milena, Carmen sees some light at the end of the tunnel, or at least little specks of light. We wanted to give you the last word on whether there is also positive developments in the US, and what you see that are initiatives that could be amplified or that show that the US is maybe on a good path with international justice.
Yes, well, the United States does support international criminal justice, at least, in some cases, and there have been some developments. So, for example, the United States War Crimes Act, which had been on the books since 1996, was recently updated. So there's a new War Crimes Act that was just signed into law in 2023, which expands the jurisdiction of U.S. courts, where now U.S. courts have jurisdiction over universal jurisdiction type offenses so long as the offender is in the United States. So this significantly expands the ability of U.S. courts to actually prosecute cases. And in the context of Ukraine, we recently saw that 4 individuals were charged by a district court in Virginia. The United States also has other laws on the books, such as, for example, the so-called Alien Tort Statute, which allows for civil suits, not criminal cases, but civil lawsuits in U.S. courts for violations of the law of nations by aliens, and which can cover atrocity crimes and situations of atrocity crimes that have taken place abroad. And so we have seen litigation and a limited number of prosecutions in U.S. courts, which do support global accountability efforts.
I always enjoy having Americans on the show because there really is always this, there's a deep honesty often in examining your own issues, but there's also a hell of a lot of optimism and getting go-ness, and we can make the change. We've just come to the end of the podcast now, Milena, and we like to wrap up with a question or two that you can't prepare for. And one is, we ask all the lawyers who come on here, do you have a favourite case that you either brought you into this field? I remember you were a practicing lawyer before you became an academic, or maybe something that you always refer to and, like all of your students, say, oh my God, she's talking about that one again, or one that you just kind of keep in your mind and you say, this is the one that I aspire to. A favourite court case?
I have a favorite case. It's unfortunately sort of like a negative, but this is really what partially drew me into the field, or at least what drew me to this notion of, look, what the U.S. does is oftentimes contrary to international law. So there's a U.S. Supreme Court case called U.S. versus Alvarez-McCain, where the U.S. Drug and Enforcement Agency agents had kidnapped a Mexican national from Mexico because this person was suspected of being involved in the murder of a U.S. federal agent. So they kidnapped this guy, brought him to the United States forcibly, prosecuted him in U.S. courts. And when this person's lawyers complained and said, look, but U.S. and Mexico have a bilateral extradition treaty. Why was my client kidnapped? Why wasn't there an extradition request? The courts basically said, too bad, even though you were forcibly abducted, we can still prosecute you. And our Supreme Court also said, well, the bilateral extradition treaty doesn't have a specific clause in there that prohibits kidnappings. And so long as the treaty doesn't have the specific clause prohibiting kidnappings, it's okay to kidnap people, essentially. Now, you can imagine how, from a reciprocity standpoint, imagine what the United States would do if Mexican agents came into, Texas and kidnapped U.S. nationals and forcibly brought them to the United States. So that's a case that I read when I took international law as a student, and I really thought to myself, wow, this can't be right. So I thought to myself, I have to do everything within my powers through my academic work to argue against those types of approaches to global affairs.
Wonderful. I hadn't heard of that case yet. We also always ask on the pod, what are you watching, reading, listening to? What can you recommend to our listeners that can be either related to the field of international justice, or it can be what you do to get away from all of it?
So I actually just finished rereading Beloved by Toni Morrison, which I had read a long time ago, 15, 20 years ago. And I just reread it now and absolutely loved it. And I do find that as we evolve and mature in our personal lives, sometimes you read a book again and you understand it completely differently. Something you read when you were 16 or 18 or 20, and maybe you loved it, but you understand it in a specific way. And you reread that when you're 40 or 50 or 60, whatever age you are. And it's still the same plot, but you sort of understand things differently. You identify with the characters differently. And so I really recently have started doing that, more rereading, classics that I read a relatively long time ago and enjoyed.
Oh, that sounds lovely as an idea. I should do that with some of my favorites.
I tend to do it with children's books and just really enjoy them, sort of reading them as an adult. But I will look up a copy of Toni Morrison's Beloved and reread it with that recommendation. Thank you so much, Milena, for that quick hop, skip and a jump to just prepare us for next week's US elections. And thank you very much for taking all the criticism that the rest of the world has of the US on the chin and saying, yes, we need to do better. So thank you very much.
It was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie Vandenberg, in partnership with the Hague Humanity Hub. Music is by Autonautics.com. You can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.